I still think law enforcement officers should be the ones to protect our schools. I've heard all the arguments for teachers to be armed, and while this bill was significantly changed on this topic, I am still not persuaded. I know that many believe this bill has too much gun control. I respect the sincerity and the validity of both of these viewpoints.
Welcome back to AM Joy. Florida Governor Rick Scott, who has had an A+ rating from the NRA for his obedience on guns, including urging no legislative action after 49 people were gunned down in the Orlando nightclub massacre of 2016, and after 5 people were killed in another rampage at the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport just last year, an action that benefited no one except the NRA and its formidable lobbyist, Marion Hammer. That same Rick Scott in the Republican-dominated Florida legislature on Friday finally stood up to Hammer and the NRA. After initially refusing to say how he would respond to the bill, and 3 weeks after a gunman opened fire at a high school in Parkland, Florida on Valentine's Day, killing 17 students and teachers, Governor Scott signed the first gun restrictions in Florida in more than 20 years. The new law, named for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, requires a 3-day waiting period for most gun purchases, bans the sale or possession of bump fire stocks, raises the minimum age for purchasing firearms to 21, and gives law enforcement the authority to temporarily confiscate firearms from those deemed mentally unstable. The NRA, naturally, is suing the state of Florida over that common sense gun legislation. And by the way, the bill is far from perfect. It also opens the door to certain staffers, but notably not teachers other than ROTC instructors, voluntarily carrying concealed weapons in schools. And the Tallahassee Democrat reports that the bill fails to allocate enough money to fund its mandate that every Florida school have an armed school resource officer. And yet, the new law, fought for by the Parkland students and their parents, is a rare victory for advocates of gun reform and was unimaginable just 3 weeks ago, when the legislature cowered before Marion Hammer and the NRA and refused to even take up an assault weapons ban. It's a victory described by Parkland survivor David Hogg as a small step in a huge movement and only the beginning. Join me now, Mark Caputo, senior writer for Politico, Nadine Smith of the LGBTQ advocacy group Equality Florida, former Republican Congressman David Jolly, and Brandon Wolf, a survivor of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. Brandon, I'm going to go to you first to get your reaction to the signing of this bill.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. Listen, first of all, I think it's really important not to lose sight of who actually got this legislation passed. And that is the Parkland students. That's their parents. That's their passion. They made it clear that the NRA's power has left the building, that we're done having a conversation, we're done negotiating with them. So I think it's important not to forget that piece. And second of all, I don't know if anybody else on this show is here for this, but I'm not here to give Rick Scott a Girl Scout cookie for showing up to work. He is 22 years late on this issue. He's still got an A+ rating from the NRA. And to me, it's pathetic that 2 years ago, after the Pulse nightclub shooting took my 2 very best friends and 47 others, he didn't care enough. But now that he wants another job and he wants people to think he's doing something in Tallahassee, he's decided to pass legislation. So I'm sorry, but he's just doing exactly what he should have done a long time ago.
And I think that is a very fair criticism, Mark Caputo, because, you know, Rick Scott had some power here to make alterations to the bill. He himself is on record being opposed to the arming of teachers in schools. He even said it in his bill signing announcement. He was not for banning assault weapons, which was one of the Parkland students' asks, and the bill also doesn't suspend AR-15 sales, ban high-capacity magazines, or strengthen background checks. So a lot of people are seeing it as pretty weak sauce, pretty minor. And Rick Scott didn't use his line item veto to take out the thing he says he doesn't want. Under Florida law, Scott could have used his line item veto authority to reject the funding of a $67 million Guardian program that would allow some teachers to volunteer to carry guns after undergoing 132 hours of firearms and 12 hours of diversity training. Earlier this week, Florida senators tweaked the bill in an attempt to make it more appealing to Scott, altering the Guardian program to exclude those who exclusively perform classroom duties, i.e. teachers. And Scott added that he talked to legislators about diverting funds not used for the Guardian program to employ more law enforcement officers, and said if he vetoed the bill, that would not be possible. Do you buy that explanation of why he didn't veto something he opposed?
Well, I guess there's a few different ways to look at it. Technically, he is correct. There's something called the Legislative Budget Commission, which is a joint commission of House and State House and State Senate leaders who get together periodically to meet to readjust money in the budget. And if the money was vetoed completely out of this bill and out of this legislation, it could have made it more difficult to shift money within the budget there. He is right, and you are right. You know, $67 million is not going to be spent on this program. It is a voluntary program. And all of the big urban counties, in large part because of the outcry from the lawmakers in those counties, are not going to opt into this program. They don't want to see more guns in school. As for Scott, why didn't he do more to get lawmakers just to take out the, as we're calling it, the armed teachers provision? It's a good question. On one hand, Scott's been around long enough that he knows that you don't want to get too far involved sometimes in legislative fights because you wind up just losing. The other thing is that there's a delicate balance here. For gun control advocates, this bill certainly isn't very far, doesn't go far enough, but gun rights folks really hate it. And so as a result of having to kind of appease both the right and the left, this armed teachers thing was left in there. The bill ultimately did pass. It was kind of dramatic in the Florida Senate. It only passed by 1 vote. So it gives you an idea of kind of the delicate nature of it. In the end, the big thing, you know, for someone like me, I'm not just a reporter, I'm the husband of a teacher who teaches in a rough neighborhood in Miami. And in that school, they get gunfire that comes from the neighborhood toward the school. In some cases, they've had bullets come through the classroom. Me, as the husband of a teacher, would really like to see her windows at least be bulletproof and her doors be safe, and this bill does do that.
It does do that. And it's interesting, Nadine, that...
Well, hopefully, better said, hopefully the lawmakers and the school board will use the money appropriately and spend it like that, because right now the school and the classroom is not safe.
Yeah, and it is interesting how, Nadine, the politics on this, I mean, having lived in Florida for a really long time, the politics on this are actually really different. That it seemed to be that the pressure on lawmakers was not to oppose the bill to appease Marion Hammer, but to pass something with the name Marjorie Stoneman Douglas on it, right? That they had to pass something for the teachers like Mark's wife because they were getting demands from the teachers, demands from the students, demands from the parents. And so the pressure was actually in the reverse direction it normally is. And the politics were a bit flipped. You had Democrats, you had House Democrats bitterly divided on the bill. The Democratic caucus votes 21-9 against the bill because of what they consider a poison pill about the, you know, carrying of weapons in school. How do you see this changing? You're backing the No NRA Money hashtag that has already signed up hundreds of people to say they won't take the NRA's money. Do you think the politics really have begun to shift in the other direction?
I do, and again, I think it's the students backed by their parents that have opened this door, but we can't ignore the fact that, of course, it's an election year. And the polling is overwhelming that people want to see a ban on assault weapons. They want to see the end of these high-capacity magazines, and they want to see much better background checks, and that the NRA positions are out of sync. Now, what we have in Florida is 67% of Florida legislators have an A rating from the NRA. So this is a little bit of a loosening of the grip, but at the end of the day, this is perhaps the least you could do to distance yourself a bit from the NRA at a moment of intense pressure coming, you know, the difference between what happened in the wake of Pulse when 49 people were killed and every single promise that Rick Scott made has been broken or forgotten. So this is a contrast. This is obviously progress, but it is so far from what they had a golden opportunity to do. So Marion Hammer's grip on the Florida legislature may have loosened a bit, but it's still there. Yeah. And I don't think, I think if you check the records, probably one of the first phone calls that Rick Scott made was to Marion Hammer. I don't think the lawsuit is a surprise, and we really have to treat this as the beginning. And the last thing I want to say about the teachers arming staff, you know, they stress the fact that it's voluntary. I grew up in the panhandle of Florida. The people that you really don't want having guns in school are the people who really, really want to have guns in school.
Yeah, and I want to amplify that point just by playing Cynthia Stafford, State Representative Cynthia Stafford from Miami, furthering the point about why it is so dangerous, the idea of arming people in the classroom. Take a listen.
I believe this is dangerous because there is an implicit bias that exists against boys and girls of color. I am afraid that in an emergency situation, a black or brown student who may be running down the hall to get away like everyone else, who reaches for his or her cell phone to call their parent, may be seen not as a student, but as the shooter.
And I want to amplify that point that that is not why the NRA opposed the bill. They're suing because they're upset that teenagers can't buy AR-15s. That is what they say is wrong with the bill. They don't care about that. They just care about the fact that they think, in their view, teenage girls should be able to buy it because they don't commit mass shooting. Pretty incredible. David Jolly, I want to go to you on this because the point that the people who want guns the most and are the most vociferous and really extremist about this tend to be people who you think, yeah, that is a person I'd like to see restricted. You were threatened, according to the Tampa Bay Times, by a man who went on Twitter and called for you to be shot, a 55-year-old Clearwater man who's now been arrested, angered by the fact that you have strayed from the orthodoxy of the Republican Party. Do you see that kind of extremism actually now whipsawing on the NRA and hurting them because they're associated with people that crazy?
Sure, it should, and it's a product of 20 years of absolutism by the NRA. But, you know, without going too far into that case, Joy, it is a perfect case study of what we're having this national debate over. Look, in this situation, I don't know if the penal system is the best route for this gentleman or if the mental health system is the best route. What I do know is he should not have access to firearms. And I'm now involved in litigation to try to ensure that. I think what we've heard from a lot of guests today is this struggle between optimism and realism. It is mildly historic that we saw a Republican legislature in Tallahassee do something, but there really isn't a lot of history in what's actually in the bill, right? This realism that it harmonizes the age and it harmonizes the waiting period. The new police powers when it comes to mental health or people in distress are important, but it doesn't approach high-capacity weapons. It doesn't approach comprehensive and universal background checks. It doesn't approach the magazine issue either. And so is it enough to release a little bit of the anger within the state? Yes, but I'd say watch out for March 24th because there are pats on the back right now to the Florida legislature, but across the country on March 24th, this issue gets real again.
Well, it gets real, Brandon, but you're also seeing, I mean, I guess, just being a very cynical former Floridian, any legislation, in 20 years, there hasn't been any legislation that goes in this direction on gun reform. Now you have the NRA seemingly hysterical. They're suing, and you now have the Department of Justice, the Jefferson Sessions Department of Justice, preparing and filing regulations to ban bump stocks. It does feel like it's incremental, but there's movement.
Yeah, there is movement. I think that we have to acknowledge that, right? Celebrate the small wins while keeping the long-term goal active. And there's a reason that the NRA feels hysterical, and that's because they've lost their grip on this conversation. The fact that we have 17 and 18-year-old students using hashtag no NRA money tells you exactly where this conversation is going, because we have a generation of students who grew up thinking that mass shootings are normal in this country, and they're sick and tired of it. They're not afraid of the NRA like former generations are. They're not under their thumb like everybody has been. NRA TV isn't reaching them because nobody cares to listen. I think people like Dana Loesch and the NRA are terrified of what's possible coming from these teens. I think, the NRA Money campaign has reached over 80 million people on Twitter. I don't know if Dana Loesch has ever seen the number 80 million people ever in her life. And that's what has the NRA the most afraid, is that this generation is not scared of them. They're not scared of taking them on, and they're not scared of having that conversation. So I think it's important to celebrate those small wins, but I don't think they're done yet.
Absolutely. And Nadine, to the point of whether politicians are becoming afraid of their association with the NRA, are you seeing that?
Absolutely. We've got over 300 lawmakers and candidates that have signed the NoNRAmoney.org pledge. It's also open to voters, people who are saying, I will not vote for a candidate that takes money from the NRA. And we've seen since the beginning of this campaign, businesses fleeing as quickly as they can from the NRA brand. People are asking questions. You see the polling overwhelmingly supporting the common sense measures that David was just talking about. We cannot continue down the path that the NRA, the answer to every problem with the NRA is more guns and more guns and more guns. So, one of the students asked, okay, so we harden our schools and we arm our teachers. Are we going to have armored school buses? In nightclubs, do we have armed bartenders? At veterans' homes, do we have armed nurses? I mean, at a certain point, we have to address the fact that fundamentally being able to fire up to 180 bullets in, about a minute is a problem that begins with removing that possibility of killing that many people that quickly off of our streets.
And Mark, are you seeing in your reporting, are Republicans starting to get that message that they cannot stand foursquare with the NRA and survive politically?
I think what you saw the past few weeks is the conservative lawmakers who are A-rated by the NRA, they just shut up. They didn't say anything. In fact, on the House floor, when this bill was debated, only one Republican member who voted against it spoke up, and he, incidentally, is running for Attorney General and has been running on a pro-gun platform. But I think the jury is pretty out on whether this change is going to be followed up by more change, and whether these lawmakers really perceive having an NRA rating, A rating, is truly a negative. Because so far, in Florida at least statewide, it hasn't been. And one of the reasons for that is not the NRA money, but it's more of the NRA culture. And what they've been able to do is they've been able to make guns and firearms part of an American cultural experience, especially for white people, white voters.
Well,
now, we're starting to see a rise of anti-gun voters. And if they start to get activated, then we're going to see something we haven't seen. But I haven't yet seen that rise of true anti-gun voters yet. Could happen, could be happening right now. I think the jury's out. We just have to wait to the elections to see what happens.
Yeah, and David Jolly, last word to you on this, because the NRA has sort of aligned itself with the so-called alt-right. They've made it a cultural issue. They've been sent signals that it is these sort of scary brown people that you need to arm yourself for civil war against, and it's really crazy messaging. That next generation, very multiracial, very multicultural. They're not interested in that message. Does your party understand that this utter alignment with the NRA is actually long-term dangerous? Dick's Sporting Goods doing pretty well, having walked away from them. Walmart, Delta, doing pretty well.
I think if you study the word and deed of most Republicans, no, they don't understand. Look, the NRA has successfully indoctrinated today's generation of Republican leaders in Congress. But you're right, the next generation is going to be different. What we don't know, Joy, is what side deals were struck. And what I say about that is we know going into November, the NRA and Rick Scott will still be buddy-buddy. If you look at what the NRA did yesterday, they did not hit Rick Scott hard. They hit the bill hard, but they didn't lay a real hard glove on Rick Scott because they know they need him long run. The very encouraging thing, the lessons out of what we saw in Florida right now is, first, states can lead where Washington fails to. Second, citizens can lead. I think we'll see assault weapons ban on the ballot in Florida as a constitutional amendment in probably 2020. But finally, what we saw is if you are a Republican today not speaking about more reasonable gun control, you're out of step with where the body politic is in the heart of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark Caputo, Nadine Smith, David Jolly, Brandon Wolf, thank you all.